Welcome to Brighter Futures, the film series about how research changes policy and improves lives. A warm welcome in this episode to Pawan Adhikari from the Essex Business School at the University of Essex. In this episode, we're talking about public sector accountability and how big institutions and structures can be changed. So, Pawan, you've been working on accounting norms and public capacity, especially in Nepal, but also elsewhere in emerging economies, particularly in South Asia. Tell us a bit about that research.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. And as you mentioned, this public sector accountability is a very important tool because we see this accountability is directly connected to providing this efficiency, effectiveness in public services and advancing economic growth. So in the last few years, there have been a lot of reforms in the public sector, basically to change the way accountability function, because one critique concern that accountability has become very much compliance oriented, mainly in developing countries, because the idea is just to let's say we talk about accounting. So the whole focus of accountability is to show whether budget has been implemented as it is or not. But however, many other things like efficiency, effectiveness in using resources, all or the voices of marginalized people and communities, all these important things are not well addressed. So a lot of reforms have been happening, like for instance, we talk about new public management, we talk about new public governance, we talk about publicness or creating public value, and developing countries are not an exception. Like Nepal. Nepal has been trying to improve accounting norms or public sector accountability since 1980s.
So you've been working on some of that. So could you tell us a little bit about how, because that could sound like it's a little bit dry, because it's about the kind of the plumbing of the way the institutions work, but it is about kind of efficiency and effectiveness and making people's lives better. So how have you been doing that work around introducing that into Nepal?
Yeah, thank you very much. Because the whole idea was to introduce some kind of Western-led regulations and norms. No? Means, let's say, how to improve accountability. It could be improved by changing the accounting system. It could be improved by changing the budgeting system, or it could be improved by changing the reporting system. So what the government in Nepal did was they adapted all these best practices in terms of regulation. So they were concerned about adapting sophisticated or advanced accounting. They also adapted this long-term budgeting framework and also performance reporting. But the whole idea was there was some kind of limited knowledge whether these techniques or regulations will work in developing country context or not, because there was not much focus on education, there was not much focus on capacity development, and there was not much focus on developing basic infrastructure to support these kind of advanced reform. So what I did was I had, of course, doing a lot of research about government accounting in Nepal, and I talked to the government officials, I talked to professional accountants, and we tried to see, okay, what was lacking in Nepal, or what we need to do, what kind of infrastructure we need to have before we implement those Western-led reform. And then we identify, okay, the first thing is we should have some kind of basic accounting manual, because accounting was done differently by different public sector entities. So the first thing is to standardize.
Yeah.
Okay, all these entities will develop accounting and financial reporting in the same way. So therefore, the first thing was we tried to develop accounting manual and accounting code. And the next thing was we need to standardize. But instead of adapting accounting standards directly, what we did was we tried to identify some of the large ministries and piloted the project. So in the process, we know what are the challenges we need to encounter when to implement those kind of reforms at small level entities. And we also try to train public sector accountants, government officials in the process. So in a way, of course, it took some time. It took 5 to 6 years. But now the government has implemented accounting standards throughout all big ministries. The government has implemented accounting manual. The government has implemented accounting code. So all these things have provided some kind of infrastructure to advance more public sector accountability reforms.
So if we were looking from the outside at all of these changes, the really fundamental ones over a 5 or 6 year period, as you say, what would we be seeing in terms of the impacts? How would we be describing them? I'm using the we as maybe members of the public in Nepal or international agencies engaging with the government. Would they be seeing some kind of positive impacts of these changes?
Yes, of course. We can see impact at several levels. For instance, at the people level, now people can take the financial statements of different public sector entities and they can compare which entity is working well and which entity is not working well given the amount of resources. At the higher level, we see like before, different donors, they used to prescribe their own regulations or procedures for accounting, but now the donors are more comfortable using government report and statement. So in a sense, we can see there's a more trust is being built and there's some sort of accountability has been developed compared to the last few years. Yeah, that is probably the very visible impacts. And
has that meant that, I mean, if we were to take kind of some of the big challenges facing us now, one would be climate change. The agencies within Nepal are more able to take positive action when addressing big challenges, big social and institutional and ecological challenges.
Yeah, thank you, because you mentioned climate change, and recently I had the opportunity to work with the World Bank and PAYFA with our Essex Business School team, and we studied climate change and climate financing in 3 South Asian countries. Nepal was one of the countries we studied, and we found more or less the same situation. In terms of policy, in terms of regulations, the government of Nepal appears to be very advanced in terms of dealing with climate change. They have all this climate change policy, there is climate budgeting, there is this NDF or national level planning, government has signed.
Nationally determined contributions and so forth,
Yeah, the government has signed Paris Agreement, there's a Sendai framework, so everything is there, but our finding shows that there is a clear gap in terms of implementation, because the priorities or strategies set at the central level are not being translated at the local and provincial level, and therefore the life and livelihood of those people, those vulnerable people, haven't been changed at all.
And so do you see that as the next stage? Is there a recognition that there's a bit of a gap there? There's still more work to do?
Yeah, there's still a bit more work to do. So what we are doing is now we are talking to government Nepal, the Ministry of Finance, and we are doing a series of workshops and some kind of training program. So we try to working in a way that those policies, priorities or budget code will be implemented at the local level or provincial level, and those policy and the regulations will have positive impact on the life and livelihood of those people who are affected by climate change.
And does that mean that some of those advances that have been made within Nepal, those lessons are being learnt by some of the other countries in the region? I mean, are others looking at Nepal, maybe it's the World Bank, is taking the lessons and spreading them elsewhere? Does that mean that becomes an exemplar for other countries and other changes?
Yeah, based on our report, I can say that compared to Nepal, compared to Sri Lanka or India, we found that Nepal was quite good in terms of regulations, because of there's a budget code for climate, and now the government claims that almost more than 40% of budget are kind of climate resilience or supporting the government objective of climate change. And then we also found there is a climate change, public expenditure tracking survey. So those kind of things are I think very good in terms of mitigating the impact of climate change, and those techniques or procedures can be disseminated to other developing countries.
And Nepal, of course, being on the southern edge of the Himalaya mountain range, I mean, this is a part of the world that's going to be severely affected by the climate crisis, the melting of glaciers, the threat to drinking water sources. So it's right on the front line of those kind of changes.
Yeah, exactly. So, also, I think Nepal is one of this very earthquake zone. So it's today 1.5 to 2% of the economic impact of climate change is 1.5 to 2% of GDP. But that we assume will rise significantly in the next coming decades or years. So it's very important for government to have policies plan, climate budget. But the most important thing is to implement those planned policy budget at those areas affected by climate change. And so the benefit goes to those people who are affected by the adverse consequences of climate changes in the country and beyond.
Very interesting. So you've described the establishment of accounting procedures, of manuals, of budgeting, of transparency between agencies within Nepal, and that's made them more able to be ready and act when it comes to climate change. Just summarize then with a couple of your hopes for the next stages of policy change.
Yeah, thank you. So the next stage, because now we know at least in the context of Nepal, they have a kind of well advanced, sophisticated budget code. But now what we are trying to do is we need to measure whether those budget has been implemented as intended or not. So we are trying to see but there is a lack of accounting, because budget is one thing, but we can't track the result, or we can't monitor, or we can't verify the government claim. For instance, 40% budget are climate resilience. In what sense? Because there's no mechanism to measure, to verify. Therefore, we are claiming there should be some sort of climate accounting as well. That is presently missing in Nepal. So our next goal in the next few years is to work with the government of Nepal and to develop some kind of accounting framework for climate change and climate budgeting in the country.
Pawan Adhikari from the Essex Business School, thank you very much indeed. You've been watching the latest episode of Brighter Futures, the film shorts about how policy can be affected by research in a positive way. If you'd like to hear more conversations about ideas that improve lives, then pop across to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.